Thank you everyone for showing up today. Let's just get started. Um, well, hold a second. Sorry. Okay. Um, so many current criticisms of the DSM emphasize its use of operational definitions. Hold it here. Sorry. And according to these criticisms, the diagnostic criteria are just shallow symptom checklists based on surface features only. And the descriptions are heterogeneous. So people will talk about how, with 5 out of 9 symptoms to be depressed, 2 people can meet criteria for depression and share only 1 symptom in common. So let's take a closer look at operational definitions. And in the philosophy of science, operational definitions were introduced in an attempt to seek agreement on the meaning of terms. And so if the operations that you use, what you do to come up with a measure, should be repeatable from person and situation to situation. And S.S. Stevens is a psychologist who advocated for the use of operational definitions, said, we need these things to eliminate hazy ambiguities, which result in ceaseless argument and dissension. So here's an example of an operational definition of soluble. A substance is soluble if and only if, when placed in water, it dissolves. The thing is, what if it's not placed in water? This operational definition only defines solubility for objects placed in water. What if it dissolves in alcohol, but not in water? Again, that's not covered by this operational definition. And so one of the lessons we take from this is that operational definitions are partial definitions. So let me, and that's all they can ever be. Let me look at an operational definition of major depressive disorder using a test called the PHQ-8. Little interest or pleasure in doing things, feeling down, hopeless, trouble falling asleep or sleeping too much, feeling tired or having little energy, poor appetite or overeating, feeling bad about yourself or that you're a failure, concentration difficulties, suicidal ideation, and psychomotor agitation or retardation. So in the DSM, these diagnostic criteria, there's 2 features that we want them to have to be good diagnostic criteria. The first is that they should be sensitive. That means they should be able to correctly detect depression. But the second feature you want in a DSM criterion is that you want it to be specific, meaning that it can distinguish between, say, being depressed and not depressed, or distinguish between depression and anxiety or depression and psychosis. Now, what that means, though, is that there are also non-specific symptoms of depression. That means that they're sensitive to depression, they're not specific to depression, but because they're not specific to depression, they're not going to be included in the DSM definition. And some of these things are irritability, depersonalization, anxiety, headaches, gastrointestinal distress, and rumination, all perfectly good depression symptoms, except for they lack specificity. Oh, and and sensitivity to interpersonal rejection. So the idea here is that there's more to depression than included in a DSM operational definition. So, or another way to say it is DSM operational definitions were not designed to be content valid or complete representations of a construct. Or you shouldn't take a DSM criterion list and expect it to be a textbook of psychopathology. You need a lot more to understand psychopathology than the DSM. So let's take a look at the criticism again. 5 of 9 criteria to be depressed. And 2 people can be diagnosed with depression and have only 1 symptom in common. So another things that people will say is, well, then, there's 126 possible combinations to cross the diagnostic threshold. 126 possible ways to be depressed. Or is that what that means? 126 different kinds of depression at the threshold? Because that's sometimes what the criticism implies. I don't know, but I think maybe when this criticism was first articulated, to some it might have looked almost a little silly, in the sense that, some of this is just rules of combinatorial mathematics. Whenever you have multiple ways to reach an outcome, you can combine them in different ways. And the more ways you have, the more combinations you have. So let's take a look at the Beck depression inventory. This has 21 items, and they're scored on a Likert scale 0, 1, 2, 3. And you need to score 21 in order to be considered moderately depressed. So if you do the math, there's over 42.5 billion ways to cross the threshold for moderate depression on the BDI. If we look at the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory Scale 2, which is a depression scale, has 55 items on it. And this is a lot easier to do the math on because it's just yes or no. And you need to have a score of 21 to be considered clinically significant score on depression. There's over 841 trillion ways just to cross the depression threshold. And on the MMPI with 55 items, 2 people can cross the depression threshold and not answer any items the same way. And so, I just kind of wonder if in some extent, this kind of criticism is an example of, if you just keep repeating it, people believe it. Like what wasn't probably taken to be a serious criticism in the beginning, if you say it long enough, it becomes to be seen as a serious criticism. And, another possibility here is that you don't really see this criticism oftentimes with respect to depression. You see it with respect to something like borderline personality disorder. And I think about the time this criticism was first instituted, they had just they had removed a lot of psychoanalytic background from the manual. Except for, this is in the DSM-3. They removed a lot of the psychoanalytic background, but they added in 2 straight-on psychoanalytic categories. Borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. And, for a lot of reasons, people were predisposed to not like borderline personality disorder. And so this criticism of 126 different ways to be borderline, may have seemed attractive in that sense. So the question is, though, I said maybe seemed kind of silly. Why would that be? Because for the DSM architects, they would assume that there are underlying or hidden features that produce symptoms. So the symptoms are only indicators. They're not the disorder. And that would be the case for the medical model, where you have an underlying pathological process and symptoms, or in psychology, the psychology psychometric model, where you have an unobserved latent variable and fallible indicators. And so the symptoms and the indicators are there's many possible symptoms and indicators that you can use. And you can't reduce the disorder to the indicators. Another example of this, just to sort of say the same thing in a slightly different way, is Ken Kendler's distinction between the indexical versus constitutive relationship between symptoms and disorders. So in the indexical model, symptoms signal disorders, but they're not coextensive with them. In the constitutive model, disorders are the symptoms. So there's nothing to depression above and beyond the symptoms. And if you meet criteria, then you're depressed, period. That's what it means to be depressed. And that could also mean then if you have different criteria, then you have different kinds of depression. Now, in the indexical model, again, there's 126 ways to indicate major depressive disorder, but not 126 disorders. And Ken's distinction here is similar to an earlier distinction I made about what I call diagnostic literalism. In that sense, I talked about 3 kinds of literalism, but this would be literalism about diagnostic criteria, that the disorder is the criteria and nothing else. And again, even in the rest of medicine, disorders with complex and fluid symptom pictures exist elsewhere in medicine, like autoimmune disorders, where the symptoms are kind of confusing and they switch over time. I mean, sometimes you have to follow a person over time. And even if people don't share symptoms like on this particular day that you did the diagnosis, over a period of months, they could share symptoms. So, anyway, I think the idea there is that some of this criticism of operational definitions kind of may misunderstand the limits of operational definitions. Now I want to talk about sort of the same kind of material, but in a slightly different way, under the auspices of open concepts, operational definitions as open concepts. So here's a quote from a philosopher named Friedrich Waismann. Waismann was a logical positivist. He was one of the two logical positivists that were like worshipers of Wittgenstein. We can never be quite sure that we have included in our definition everything that should be included. And thus, the process of defining and refining an idea will go on without ever reaching a final stage. In other words, every definition stretches into an open horizon. Try as we may, the situation will always remain the same. No definition of an empirical term will cover all possibilities. So this is Waismann is considered to be talking about open concepts. Now, the notion of open concepts was introduced into philosophy by Arthur Papp, who talked about it as vagueness in our concepts. And what Papp said was, look, there's a malleable relationship between sort of the defining features of a term and the contingent features of the term. So a defining feature might be something like schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder, and a contingent feature might be those at ultra high risk engage in lucid-magical thinking. So this stuff is very complicated and hard to read, by the way, sort of these articles. At this point in philosophy of science, defining features like this would have been considered to be conventions. And conventions are neither true nor false. They are not arbitrary, but they're freely chosen. And then conventions also would have been considered then necessary once chosen, and they would have been considered analytic, true by definition. And so, one of the things Papp is doing here when he says there's a malleable relationship between defining features and contingent features, it's an early distinction. It's an early rejection of the analytic synthetic distinction. And the idea of, and again, very complicated, but this is kind of like the beginning of the, I say, end of the importance of scientific conventionalism in the philosophy of science, the rejection of the analytic synthetic distinction. And so what Papp's going to say is that, look, new information may always lead us to revise the concept and extend it in different directions. In this case, I guess you could say, people engage in lucid magical thinking. If we make that more definitional of schizophrenia, we can revise the concept and say that is really definitional. Let's call it schizophrenic spectrum, and psychosis becomes a contingent feature. And these kind of things can always happen. So let's look at depression again. Here's our operational definition of depression. And as we saw before, 5 or more you need 5 or more for major depressive disorder. That's definitely a convention, right? Neither true nor false, freely chosen, maybe not arbitrary. But then here's the question: why not 4 or more if there are a bunch of nonspecific or auxiliary depression symptoms like irritability, depersonalization, rumination, or a rumination, okay? In that case, in terms of open concepts, actually, rather than being not true or false, in some cases, 5 or more might be incorrect in some situations, depending on the other symptoms that are present. And so the idea, as I've been saying, is major depressive disorder has more features that are included in the DSM concept. And many combinations of symptoms could count as depression. So you have these classes of symptoms. In the cognitive class, you could have concentration problems, indecisiveness, and depersonalization. In the affective cluster, you can have sadness, anhedonia, and irritability. In the physiological cluster, you can have, fatigue, sleep disturbance, and headaches. And then the interpersonal cluster, which is is not really necessarily part of the DSM definition. You can have withdrawal and sensitivity to rejection. And so you have multiple combinations, and some combinations may be more or less depression-like. And you can have things like, in the DSM, you have depression with anxious distress, depression with melancholic features. Those are both specifiers. But then you have these depression-like things, minor depression, persistent complex bereavement, trauma-related withdrawal. And so what you get is, when you look at the symptom space, you can get a lot of variance in intermediary cases. Now, open concepts as extendable then can also generate vagueness, meaning that they generate borderline cases. And with borderline cases, that means there's no fact of the matter as to whether the concept applies. And so again, you don't necessarily want to stay at the borderline. So for example, if someone meets 9 out of 9, they're pretty clearly depressed. 9 out of 9, 8 out of 9, that you can pretty clearly specify depression. But even then, even if they meet 9 out of 9, 2 people are not necessarily going to sort of have all the same symptoms, because they could differ on nonspecific or auxiliary symptoms. Now, there's an old question in philosophy of science: is if you add and subtract features, do you change the concept? And here's a quote from Percy Bridgman, who introduced the notion of operational definitions. If we have more than one set of operations, we have more than one concept. And strictly, there should be a separate name to correspond to each different set of operations. So Bridgman infamously, said that. The thing though is, Ha-Sek Chang argues that Bridgman should not have been necessarily seen as offering a definition of meaning with operational definitions. Rather, it's a philosophy of extension. And the question is, what happens when you extend your concept or your measurement into new domains? And you just can't assume that when you extend it to new domains and you use different operations, you're measuring the same thing. So one cannot assume that different operational definitions of the same construct pick out the same cases or have all the same features. Someone in philosophy of science who sort of has pointed this out with respect to cognitive neuroscience is Jackie Sullivan, who argues that, sometimes when you see disparate findings from different labs, it may sometimes be a function of, so they're defining something like working memory, operationally defining working memory in different ways. But that doesn't mean that they're always different. Bridgman said, sometimes that they can be overlapping or similar constructs. You just cannot assume it. So, and then, if concepts are open, you can refine them for different purposes, extend them in different ways, but then still, when you extend them, see them as variants of a family, rather than saying, let's name the 840 trillion kinds of depression that are on the MMPI. And so Chang said, really, the concept is probably broader than the operational definition, or maybe sometimes operational definitions are overspecified concepts. And again, Ha-Sek Chang says, meaning is unruly and promiscuous. The kind of absolute control on the meaning of scientific concepts that Bridgman wished for is not possible. And so depending on your purposes, what you can put in the foreground and the background may shift. And sometimes, for example, a good example of that, let's say we find out that if you have meet criteria for depression and you have panic attacks, right, then you're going to have a worse outcome, a longer outcome, a worse outcome than if you don't have panic attacks. Well, then you might bring panic attacks into the foreground. And again, what you bring into the foreground and what you bring into the background from this whole cluster of symptoms and auxiliary symptoms is there's no single solution that can deal with all, that can apply to all situations. Okay, now I want to shift one more time, and I want to talk about how some of this non-specificity manifests in spectrum models in psychiatry and then in dimensional models in psychology. So first, Eli Robbins and Robert Spitzer. Robert Spitzer was the person who implemented or incorporated operational definitions into psychiatry when he led the revision of the DSM-3. And the person who taught him about operational definitions was Eli Robbins, who was a psychiatrist at Washington University in St. Louis. And the other thing one of the things Robbins is, most people might have know about Robbins is that, with Samuel Gouset, they introduced the concept of diagnostic validity into psychiatry. And when Spitzer was working on the DSM-3, Robbins and Gouset thought Spitzer overclassified things. In their mind, and they claimed that there's only actually 14 valid syndromes. And everything else, they said, is undiagnosed psychiatric disorder. And what they mean is there's a symptom space that's intermediary between syndromes and between normal and abnormal. It's probably a lot of the symptom space, and all you can do is say it's psychiatric. There's a disorder there, but we can't specify it any further. So it's a non-specific psychiatric disorder is in my terms. So let's talk about this in terms of some current thinking in psychiatry. And I'm going to discuss Patrick McGorry's notion of the pluripotential risk syndrome. McGorry is a psychiatrist in Australia, and he was studying the schizophrenia prodrome. By prodrome, when psychiatrists and psychologists talk about the prodrome, they mean the early stages of the illness. So he was studying the prodrome, and they were sort of collecting cases that they thought that people were in the prodromal stage. And they found out that there's a lot actually of cases that they aren't quite prodromal, but they're at high risk for developing schizophrenia. And so they started studying what's called ultra high risk cases. And then McGorry later on renamed this a pluripotential risk syndrome. And what he meant by this is, first of all, this thing is phenotypically broad and impossible to subtype. And it involves an intensification of normal traits like maybe increased worry or increased anger, the introduction of novel traits such as hypervigilance or delusional thinking, and kind of a gradual worsening. Other people who are studying ultra high risk talk about a placeholder diagnosis, where they say, it's a diagnosis. It's just a placeholder because we can't say more yet. There are these symptom clusters they're not captured by traditional diagnostic categories. And symptoms are drawn from across the domain of psychiatry. There's atypical combinations of anxiety, fear, obsessions, physical complaints, affective lability, attenuated hallucinations and delusions. And that's kind of, at a certain point, you can't say more than that. McGorry says, look, if the symptoms increase in severity, they may become causally linked together as a more specified syndrome. But one of the things they've learned is that although it was originally formulated as a psychosis risk category, the most common end-stage manifestation is on the anxiety depression spectrum, not what psychologists are now calling the psychosis superspectrum. And so, but at the same time, people say, look, there's a decline in functioning, so it's a disorder in its own right, but it's a non-specific. It's not. There's non-specificity to it. Weird combinations of auxiliary symptoms. Okay, so that's spectrum models. Now I want to talk a little bit about, move to psychology and talk about something called the general psychopathology factor, or P. I'm going to keep my hand down there and keep looking down. All right, so P is to, if anybody's never heard of this, it's analogous to general intelligence, or G. in the factor analytic tradition. And so just to sort of explain general intelligence, in the early 20th century, they knew that, children who are good at math tend to be oftentimes are good at reading, are good at science, are good at history, good at social studies. These things are all positively correlated. And the notion is there's something common to all these. There's some common non-specific shared factor that allows someone to sort of do well in all these different areas. And, they called it G, general intelligence. And they invented factor analysis to sort of model this mathematically. And the idea is that G is what causes someone to be able to sort of do well in all these things. And so what you have in this model is you have G, the non-specific factor, and then you're going to have, math-specific factors, reading-specific factors, science-specific factors. I want to talk about this in kind of maybe a more common sense way that people might understand. So it's probably, makes perfect sense to say, look, the number of churches and the number of bars in a town are correlated. The more churches you have, the more bars you have, and vice versa. So what does that mean? Does that mean, and so they're positively correlated, does that mean if you start building a lot of churches, you drive people to drink? Or maybe it's the other way around. If you start building a lot of bars, then people feel a need to go to church on Sunday morning to make up for Saturday night. And I think probably most people are saying, yeah, no, correlation is not causation. And the common explanation of this is that there's a third variable back there, population. And population explains the positive correlation between the number of churches and bars. As the population goes up, both churches and bars go up. So that's true. But mathematically, what that means is that if you put population in the model, the correlation between churches and bars disappears because it's all explained by the correlation. Or technically what they say is if you condition the positive correlation between churches and bars on the population, it disappears. That's what factor analysis does, right? The factor analysis, what it does is the latent variable, which is it's a third variable that is said to explain the correlations between your observed indicators. And so you're looking for these. It's not going to be like something you can see like population. Okay, it's latent, it's hidden, but you're looking for some combination of variance that when you put it together in a model, the correlation between your indicators disappears. So let's look at one factor analytic model of P, and this is the currently most popular version of it. It's called the bifactor model of P. And so we have let's say these different classes of symptoms: somatic, depressive, anxious, PTSD, conduct disorder, substance abuse, mania, delusions, and schizotypal. And it turns out that when you do a bifactor, use a bifactor factor analysis, you do get a general factor called P. It's a sort of a non-specific general distress, psychiatric distress that explains the positive correlation between these symptoms, or they would say explains the tendency sometimes for these symptoms to be comorbid. Now in the bifactor model, not only do you get the general non-specific factor, but then you get more specific factors that are independent of P, that are statistically independent of P. And so, for example, these are often called internalizing, which is said to explain comorbidity between somatic, depressive, anxiety, and PTSD type presentations. Externalizing explains comorbidity between conduct disorder and substance abuse, and thought disorder would explain comorbidity between, say, mania, delusions, and schizotypy. Now, this is in some psychological tests, well before people started talking about P, there was a P-like construct. It's called general distress, particularly in the MMPI tradition. General distress, the first factor on the MMPI. And it's sort of a non-specific, things are worse for me right now. Oftentimes it's anxiety, depression type symptoms. But it's a broad cluster. No symptoms are necessary. There's many contingencies. But and again, this is old notion in psychological testing. Now, as a dimension, and factors are dimensions, right? That's what dimensional models are. Dimensional models are latent variable models. So latent variable is a dimension. It's like it's a variable on which everyone has a value, like height. Everyone has a value on height. Everyone has a value on weight. So for these dimensions, it's a dimension on which everyone has a value. So the higher one standing on P, the more likely one is to over time experience symptoms drawn from across the domain of psychopathology. The higher one standing on P, the more likely one is to have recurrent and or chronic distress. Now, as an open concept then, again, based on what I said earlier, you can foreground a specified syndrome, but the thing is, the non-specific symptoms, the auxiliaries, you can call them, P, right, are going to remain. They're going to remain in the background, and it's not like they're not there. They're just not. Again, they may not be a part of the DSM definition, but they're still there in the background, and they can become a part of the definition depending if it seems to be useful for understanding a case or group of cases. And so, and sometimes, here's another example of this kind of shifting what's in the foreground and in the background. And now for I would also, you could also talk about this as redescription, redescribing things. So if we start out in the 17th century with hysteria and hypochondriasis, right? What Freud does is he pulls part of that out, switches what's in the foreground and what's in the background, and renames it hysteria. In the 1950s, the ego psychologists, those were psychoanalytic, that's a psychoanalytic theory, they foregrounded the personality traits and called it histrionic personality disorder. In the early 1970s, a psychiatrist named Donald Klein foregrounded the affective traits and called it history dysphoria. Now, everybody that Klein diagnosed as history dysphoria would be probably diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And so, you kind of like, you can extend the concept, extend it this way, extend it that way, redescribe it. Now, and I have to say, just, for philosophical purposes, like the concept of G, the reality of general psychopathology, of the general psychopathology factor, is a contested hypothesis. Because rather than a causal variable, it may be more like an index. And an example of an index is socioeconomic status. Okay, socioeconomic status is an index referring to things like education, occupation, and income. But education and income are correlated, but the correlation between education and income is not caused by your socioeconomic status. And another example of an index is the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It's an index of the stock prices of 30 companies on the New York Stock Exchange, but the Dow Jones Industrial Average does not cause the stock prices. Maybe another example would be something like health. There's not a thing that you have in your body that causes you not to be sick or that causes you to live a long life. And then so again, P may be an index. It may be a description that says, this person likely has a lot of comorbid symptoms and they're likely to have current distress, but it doesn't necessarily cause the comorbidity. Now, the notion of relatively non-specific distress, though, is not new. Here's a quote. "It would take up too much time to enumerate all the symptoms belonging to hysteric diseases. So much do they vary and differ from each other. Nor do they only differ so greatly, but are so irregular likewise that they cannot be comprehended under any uniform appearance, as is usual in other diseases, but are a kind of disorderly train of symptoms, so that it is difficult to write the history of this disease." And that is a quote from Thomas Sydenham at the very beginning of modern medical classification. So how might we describe this situation philosophically? So metaphysically, we might say that in some cases, the world is indeterminate. And with our conceptual contrast, like depressed versus anxious or disordered versus normal, we're projecting precision into the world when the world is sometimes less defined or determined than our concepts demand. Let's see. Okay, I got it. But here's the thing. I think you have to be careful. You don't, and about claiming that vague, non-specific concepts are the best we can do, and let's settle for them. Like you don't want to be like vague as a matter of vagueness as a matter of principle, or what Paul Meal called you. You don't want to just you don't want to be you want the word to just be muddled and vague, just because you like it that way. Sometimes you have concepts: nervous breakdown, mad, crazy, loco. These are probably non-specific in an unhelpful way. And what we're left with is, you have, you can have, sometimes you things can be very non-specific and you can't say more. But sometimes you want to get specific. Sometimes you can be overspecified, and there's no one solution to all situations. And you may go back and forth between sort of these different grains, I guess you could say. Again, depending on the situation or the context. Here's an example of no one solution. When they were going to revise the DSM-5, there was some thought that major depressive disorder and general anxiety disorder could be combined into something called internalizing disorders. That major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder were maybe overspecified. You don't oftentimes, particularly in treatment, you're going to treat both of them oftentimes with antidepressants. And the term antidepressant is probably overspecified. It's not an antidepressant, it's probably a negative emotion modulator. So there's some idea that let's just either call these internalizing disorders, or maybe put them in the same section of the manual and sort of expect that they're going to be comorbid and not consider that to be a problem. But it turns out that they are highly comorbid and they do share genes, but there are specific aspects to depression. Depression has specific aspects. Generalized anxiety disorder has specific aspects. They become separate because sometimes you can specify them. Another example, obsessions and compulsions in the DSM, they wanted to implement these things called cross-cutting symptom dimensions. And the idea here would be, there are non-specific kind of symptoms that cut across traditional diagnostic categories. Depression and anxiety and obsessions and substance abuse, suicidal ideation. And the idea is you should probably always assess these, not limit yourself to the specified DSM category, but sort of always assess these. But at the same time, you can't just sort of say, well, obsessions and compulsions cut across diagnostic categories, and we just need to assess them at all times and forget about the diagnostic category. Like, take the category of schizophrenia. So that's a category. And that's a specific category. And you will find that people who are schizophrenic will have obsessions, but the obsessions are different. They are more likely to have sexual content and aggressive content. The person is less likely to see them as unrealistic. They may even be experienced as a kind of a voice in the head. And so, sometimes obsessions are kind of a non-specific symptoms that cut across different disorders, but other times we want to specify that. Obsessions and schizophrenia may be a different kind of thing. So the idea here is, in terms of non-specific distress, and again, operational definitions, they're limited, and you need to consider non-specificity and not reduce your construct to the operational definition. You should never do that. And so we should seek specificity and increase precision where we can, but not fool ourselves and others into seeing things as being more determinate or self-contained than they can be. And that's that.
Thank you very much, Peter, Zachar. Thank you. We're gonna now have time for Q&A. Do you want to unshare maybe your screen?
Oh yeah, just a second. Let me, where do I, oh wait, over here. Stop share. Stop share. All right, got you.
All right, so we will be ready for the Q&A. So as always, I'll ask you to write in the chat that you have a question, or you can also write down your question in the chat, and I'm going to read it. Yeah, Justin.
Here we go. Hey, Peter. Thank you for your talk. You might have already dealt with this, and I apologize if you have. I liked at the beginning how you were pointing out that there is this traditional criticism of the DSM, where given this list of symptoms, you could have two different people who are depressed but share like one symptom, like maybe fatigue or something. And I think you pointed out rightly that that's not really a I mean, that's not in itself a criticism. It's like, okay, yeah, so what? I always took it that the underlying, and again, I'm not really sure who people have said this. I can't think of who in particular, but I always had the sense that the underlying criticism is that it was supposed to show how heterogeneous these categories are. In other words, if it's the case that two different people could be depressed and share, no or only one symptoms, that's supposed to be a pretty good indicator that these are very heterogeneous kinds. They're more like jade, than they are like gold. And again, you might have dealt with that, but
yeah,
when you present the criticism in that way, do you think that it has more merit, or that it's latching onto a kind of deeper point than this kind of trivial point about language?
So yeah, I kind of sort of referred to that when I said the descriptions are, heterogeneous. Mm-hmm. It is, but so the people who make that criticism, to be honest, Justin, it was the early on the arguments for dimensional models. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so their argument was that the dimensional model people, so what they're saying is that, first of all, they're saying that, they're saying, well, they're saying that what we really need to be classifying are sort of factor analytic derived dimensions. And if you have a factor analytic derived dimension, it's only one construct. It's a pure construct. It's not a combination of different things. Mm-hmm. And so they were criticizing that was kind of criticizing the categories, probably not so much for like being, not necessarily so much for having a pluralistic causal scenario. The biological psychiatrists, the reductionists might criticize it for that way. The dimensional model people, I think it was mostly a criticism because the construct itself is not a pure construct. So the idea would be, neuroticism is a pure construct for the dimensional model people, right? Depression is not a pure construct. It's made up of three different pure constructs: positive emotion, negative emotion, and arousal. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of, I think that was how it was originally introduced. It was kind of introducing construct purity into sort of psychiatry from psychology. But see, my only thing is that I see, our great lamented Louis Charland, was telling me how he had these undergraduates who were so angry about the DSM and what terrible thing it was, because there's so many ways you can meet criteria for borderline personality disorder, and they're gonna you know, they want to like spend their career showing what a terrible system this is. And so I mean, I think that part of my I do think there is a kind of I think it's I think it was seen as a silly criticism, and it's been taken as a serious criticism just on its merits alone. So I was just mostly trying to talk about that. I agree that there's a deeper criticism there, but even that is complicated because, again, do we want pure constructs, or can we have complicated constructs? And does it have to be one cause of depression, you know, one mechanism of depression? And if there's not, then do we have to separate it up into something where, you know, decompose it into something where there are separate mechanisms? That's all. I'm not sure that we do, to be honest, to sort of, for depression to be a useful clinical construct.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, those are just such huge questions about natural kinds and whether they should map onto these.
Right. And what's a natural kind?
Yeah.
Is it Boyd? Is it Aristotle?
Right. All right.
John Stuart Mill?
Right.
I mean, I've talked about against natural kinds, but if you take a look, you know, according to John Stuart Mill, my notion of kinds would be a kind of a Millian kind, to be honest, which I didn't realize that when I first started talking about it. But I was talking against natural kinds because I was talking against Aristotle.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
All right. We have another question from Camilo.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask you, taking an example of a concept, for example, the concept of body.
Of what?
What would you think of body?
Of body?
The body. Yes.
Okay.
What would you think if we enrich this concept, making it not phenomenologically naive? And if we just do this, how could we lessen the heterogeneous aspect you were pointing out? And if so, if that would show that the main issue you're pointing to is an issue of a conceptual framework we should be more aware of working on when we're dealing with all these concepts and categories.
Yeah, so what's the, I'm good, that's true, that makes sense. What's the question?
The question is, taking the example of the body, of the concept of body, if we make it more phenomenologically solid, don't you think that the heterogeneous aspect you were pointing out would lessen, and some of the issues that that arise could be more, one could work it out?
Possibly. I don't have a, I mean, I always find phenomenological analyses interesting, but I don't have a real good background in the details of that. Could you say a little bit more about how that would work? How would it make it less heterogeneous?
For example, if you focus, you were talking about the contrast between what you put on the foreground and what goes to the background when you're dealing with these concepts and categories.
Okay, so
if you take, let me finish. If you take the experience, the individual experience, and you applied a bit of the phenomenological methodology, epoche, etc. If that thing about what goes to the foreground and what goes to the background, isn't it much more easy to work out?
Okay, I see. Yes. I think, yeah, and to give another example, Parnas, right, talks about, with respect to psychosis, he talks about, he doesn't like, Joseph doesn't like operational definitions at all, right? And he says that I think he talks about it as a form that schizophrenia takes, a concept which he calls disturbances in the sense of self, ipsity disturbances. And he says that's the framework that you need to adopt. And if you adopt that framework, then you sort of see how things can kind of fit together. Yeah, sure. I don't. Again, yes, I agree that you can theories, new theories can help you see how things fit together. I agree with that, and I think it's useful to do that. And I think some of the phenomenological ideas about psychosis are very interesting. I still think, though, that doesn't eliminate all these non-auxiliary symptoms, and you can surely redescribe it using sort of phenomenological concepts. I'm just not sure that that's necessarily the only description that you can do. So I would only resist I generally resist with Joseph. Like, I think it's really interesting stuff that he does, but sort of the essentialistic aspects of phenomenology where they're like, this is the true concept and this is what's really going on. I tend to resist that. But otherwise, yeah, I think that those concepts can be very useful for integrating things together. Yes.
Thank you very much.
All right, we have a question in the chat from Christophe Go. So a bit broad question for you: is distress, disturbance, or that is harmful, contained in every psychiatric symptom, whether or not the clinical significance criterion is provided in the DSM? Because the characterization of an OD could depend on this question.
Let me see. Is distress contained in every psychiatric symptom, whether or not it's part in the DSM? Because it appears to be. Is distress contained in every symptom? I don't. I don't know how to answer that. There's lots of symptoms in the DSM. We have the symptom space. No, I don't necessarily think. I mean, sometimes the way they'll talk about it is the symptoms. It may be a distress symptom, or it may be a kind of social or occupational dysfunction symptom, right? I mean, someone can have concentration difficulties but not be distressed by it. Someone, I mean, you can have, you could have sleep disturbance and not be distressed by it, or overeating and not be distressed by it. For obsessions and compulsions, the general rule, I think, is that the person knows that there's something wrong, right? That this is a crazy thought, that they know it's not the case. But the problem is sometimes in schizophrenia, sometimes in schizophrenia, they don't necessarily know that it's wrong, but sometimes it's even more distressing in that way. So I'm not sure how could the characterization of OD depend on this question? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Christophe, maybe if you want to just write down maybe a clarification, and we can take another question. So Julio Ozores has a comment on the last question.
Yeah, I would say some of the things are obviously distress. I can't imagine having a panic attack and not being in distress about it, right? But I don't know that I don't necessarily know that all the symptoms are necessarily going to be accompanied with distress. Of course, I did define P as general distress, didn't I?
Do we have another question?
Distinctions between distress and general disvalue, such as harmful and harmful dysfunction.
Yes. Dr. Zachar, yeah, so that was my comment. Yes, I just thought that the prior question may have been getting at the point whether a general parameter like distress is the same thing as harm or something that we generally think of. So
Well,
they're not exactly the same thing, right? This obviously things that are distressing are bad, but does that mean they're equivalent concepts? Can one have no distress and yet be thought of having a condition that's harmful?
Understood.
Yeah.
No, of course, Jerry Wakefield talks about that all the time, right? Sort of normal distress.
Right.
We have a question in the chat from Dineke. Can symptoms also not be over-specified or under-specified? For example, second-person hallucinations or third-person hallucination inside or outside the head?
So can symptoms also not be over-specified or under-specified? I mean, I'm not sure, can you say a little bit more about what I'm not quite seeing the question. I mean, they can be.
Maybe I'm not expressing it well enough, but from your talk, you seem to assume like, look, you have a number of symptoms or a number of signs and symptoms, and you can use those in the operational definitions.
Yes.
But the thing is, I think what kind of symptoms you use in operational definitions can already make a difference, because if you just use hallucinations, you can specify that further. Like third person's hallucinations are supposedly far more common in schizophrenia, and second person hallucinations are far more common in the normal population, and a bit similar the distinction some people make with hallucinations inside and outside the head. And if you want to use, say, over-specified and under-specified with that as well, are you then not ending up in a kind of infinite regress, because you probably can criticize second-person hallucinations further? So that was my question.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that, right. I think it's sort of, what's my response to that? Yeah. I mean, these things are very difficult issues, right? I mean, I'm thinking about this as like, sort of like how philosophers of science talk about fine-grained versus coarse-grained. And
yeah,
sometimes
probably,
you want to go coarse-grained, and sometimes you want to go fine-grained. And the idea is, sometimes it's better to be coarse-grained and sometimes it's better to be fine-grained, but there's no one time that it's better to be, there's no one way to titrate it for all situations. So, I mean, yeah, you can, I mean, I guess you could say, if you look at it one way, you could say you're over-specifying a symptom, but if you look at it another way and you frame it differently, you go, no, this is exactly what we want to talk about. Again, I guess you could say if I want to call something just, it's an internalizing disorder, it's just an externalizing disorder, you could say, that's just exactly correct. For my treatment plan, all I need to know is that this person has an externalizing disorder. And then, but someone can come in and say, no, I I don't just care about whether they have an externalizing disorder. I want to know a little bit about their personality. I want to know about their moral sense. And externalizing disorder isn't good enough. It's too broad. We need to get more specific. You know, it all depends on what you're looking at with respect to the case. It's you know, it's what are your goals and what are your purposes? What are you trying to do in classifying? What do you want to achieve? And that may sort of determine how specific or how vague you can keep things.
Okay,
I don't know if that
thank you.
answers your question.
Yeah, no, that answers. I think one of the problems is, of course, that many treatments in psychiatry, or probably almost all treatments in psychiatry, are not 100% effective. So there is always the push for going more fine-grained. Whether it's useful, it's different matter.
There's a push for going more fine-grained in the sense that you want to say, well, there's something that's really going on there, and I want to find out what's really going on there. When sometimes, again, with respect to, say, talking about internalizing disorders, it's not really useful to go more fine-grained. It's just not. You know, it's again, it's a practical consideration as to sort of like how much you narrow in and how much you step back and take a look. And it's the same old issue of lumping and splitting, right? Are we going to split everything and make it as precise as possible? Is that always the best thing to do? Or maybe sometimes we just want to leave things in sort of like big lumps because that's the information we need anyway.
Okay, thank you.
We have a question from Tuomas Westerinen.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. I'm Tuomas Westerinen from the University of Helsinki, and I have a sort of general question, also in regards to your previous work and your view on psychiatric kinds of sort of these pragmatic kinds. So my question is that some people claim that the DSM classification manual, also the ICDs, filled with these sort of folk psychological conceptions and unspecified theoretical or clinical language, and therefore, you know, it has these problems. And so, you know, many people think that you should have this more this classification manual or classification based on causes or causal mechanisms instead.
Right.
So I wonder what your view is on this. Could this sort of, do you think it's a vain hope, or do you think it's something to aspire for instance, with the RDoc, or to make things more precise? So I just wonder where you have.
So that's a really good question, and it's kind of a big question. And I think that look, I mean, ultimately, if the thing with RDoc, and you know what they're looking for is, they're saying sort of we should classify based on mechanisms, right? Because if you can classify something based on mechanisms and you know how it's caused, then you can prevent it. And so, yeah, I mean, who wouldn't say, yeah, sure, great. I mean, you know, if you can take schizophrenia and you can say, here's the mechanism of sort of, say, schizophrenia, or say bipolar disorder, even better, and understand what those mechanisms are and prevent people from sort of becoming bipolar, well, we should all be for that, right? And if we're gonna split a bipolar up, we have to split bipolar up into different sort of disorders, then yeah, I mean, we should all be for that. But they haven't been able to do it yet, right? And so I'm not sure about it's just kind of a, you know, they haven't been able to do it yet. As far as the folk concepts go. Let me give another example of this. This is, I don't know if this is, I don't know if, so I don't know if this is such a good example, but think about, are people wearing the area of emotions, right? People will talk about sort of basic emotion theory, like, and there's 6 basic emotions: anger, sadness, fear, joy, surprise. I'm missing one. Guilt, I think. No, not guilt, but anyway. And the idea is, some people argue that these anger, sadness, fear, guilt, surprise, these emotions are just folk concepts, and that there's no such thing as an affect program or a mechanism that can explain anger, or an affect program or a mechanism that can explain fear, because fear is a family of heterogeneous concepts that means a lot of different things. And then for scientific purposes, then what we need to do is we need to get rid of this concept of fear, because we're never going to be able to explain it mechanistically. And we need to develop new concepts that we can have a better understanding of what our emotional life is. Well, what you can say to that is, yeah, okay, sure. That's fine. If you can do that, but that doesn't mean that fear is just a sort of a anti-scientific folk psychological concept. We can still study fear as scientists and learn a lot of things about fear. And even if we don't necessarily have a single mechanistic explanation of fear, that still mean it could still be a useful scientific concept. And I would say, probably with respect to, if you want to say depression and schizophrenia, what they don't use the word folk concepts. They say these concepts were defined by clinical tradition only, right? These concepts were defined by clinical authority and observation and tradition. They haven't been scientifically defined. And so we need to get rid of them and replace them with, the psychologists are gonna say dimensions, the RDoC people are gonna say neurocognitive dimensions that can be implemented in a neural circuit. And you can go that way, you can say that, but I would also say, with respect to things like depression and schizophrenia, they're still useful scientific concepts. They still communicate things, and we can also learn things about them, about how they came to be, what they're like now, what to expect with them in the future. So I wouldn't just, say, let's eliminate them because they're based on clinical tradition or their folk psychological concepts. If that answers your question in a long way around.
Yes, thank you very much.
We have a question from the chat from Julio Ozores. Would you conclude then that the right degree of specificity is to arrive at contracts that are, or maybe constructs that are useful, a pragmatic goal, or that are real natural kind? That's right. Yeah, that's it.
So I don't, it all depends on what you mean by a real natural kind. I don't much care for the concept of natural kind, to be honest. But because it all depends what you mean by that. I would say that the right degree of specificity is whatever allows you to reach whatever, what are your goals for classifying? What do you want to do? What do you want to achieve? And the right degree of specificity is you want to titrate that to best help you reach your goals. Whether or not, now in some cases, then what do you mean by natural kind? If you mean by natural kind something that has shared underlying causal mechanisms, well, okay, that's fine. Then maybe sometimes then that's what you want. But not necessarily, you don't necessarily need that all the time, right? Maybe sometimes a kind that's just like a Boydian homeostatic property cluster that is produced by multiple mechanisms, but it still allows you to draw generalizations, well, then maybe that's good enough.
Yes, thank you. No, that's I was wondering then whether, this is one of those perennial questions about whether this is a pragmatic matter, or whether we're trying to find, something that's true no matter what in nature,
So I would say now, what I would say now is like, let's take natural kinds. Let's say that a natural kind is a homogeneous kind with shared underlying causal mechanisms, right? That's a very practical thing to be able to identify.
Yes. In other words, if you actually can get a hold of a natural kind, it is pragmatically very useful, usually.
Correct. So
Yes.
that's why I'm like, okay, good. If you can, that might be a very useful thing to have.
Yeah.
And it's good, not because it's a privileged kind, metaphysically privileged kind, but that it's a very useful thing to
It is
have.
useful, yes.
That would be my current view on all of that. Let's see, Rachel. Hey, Rachel.
Hello.
Are you guys done for the day in Lancaster?
Yeah, I've been at a workshop all day, so my question may not be very coherent. But yeah, thanks very much. I thought that was really interesting. One of the things I wondered about is much the way you were talking was as if these non-specific symptoms were kind of part of the disorder.
Yes, I was.
Yeah, so they're like kind of common symptoms that appear in lots and lots of disorders. I wondered if there was another way of possibly looking at things. I was wondering whether, disorders are all rubbish things to suffer from. So maybe it's kind of to be expected that whether someone suffers from, schizophrenia or a phobia or maybe something physical like MS or back pain, whatever it is, you're bound to feel kind of upset about it. Like you're bound to, like as a consequence, you're bound to them. So I'm wondering whether you could think of this non-specific stuff as a kind of as an effect of having any kind of disorder, and whether it also arose with physical conditions,
Right,
and that rather than kind of being part of the disorder that the person had, it was kind of like a natural consequence.
Yes.
I was wondering that was a possibility.
Yes, it is. That would be the primary secondary distinction, right? So you could say, well, these are symptoms are primary to sort of like some depression, but then there's a secondary manifestation that's a consequence of having the depression. Yes, that's correct, and you can, and that may be some of those auxiliary symptoms may be best considered, secondary or contingent or accidental or, related to a person's reaction, all of that. That's true. And that complicates things a little bit. But I was definitely talking about it as the auxiliary symptoms as part of the symptom network out of which this disorder is identified. And it's kind of like in a Denny Borsboom sense, right? You have these complicated symptom networks with relationships between symptoms, and the idea would be, the way I was talking about in this talk is, no, they're kind of all interconnected and they're all reinforcing each other, and we're only focusing on some of them in the operational definition, but there's more to depression than just what's in the operational definition. I was definitely talking about it in that way, as kind of part of the disorder or part of the distress or something like that. But that doesn't mean that some of those so-called auxiliary symptoms can be consequences.
Can I just come back very briefly?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, like, do you get these non-specific things in cases where people have physical disorders as well? And if you do, might that push you towards shifting what you're saying? That because I mean, talking about a Borsboom type network type thing, like if you're thinking of someone that's having depressed and then they get miserable about being depressed, you can kind of see that as all being part of the same thing. But I was wondering whether you'd saying the same kind of thing about a case where someone has cancer looks more of a stretch. And then if you have the same non-specific kind of issues arising in both, might that push you towards thinking of these as all being like a natural consequence of having something that makes you feel rubbish?
Yes, it might, but I think that the idea is that that, for example, depersonalization and irritability and headaches and gastrointestinal distress and rumination are the idea is that they're all depression. They're all parts of the broader depression. They're all parts of the broader depression. And then, so an example would be they used to talk about in how depression manifests differently in countries like the United States and Britain as opposed to in the less developed parts of the world, right? And there, the depression involves more somatic symptoms and stomach complaints and headaches, and then that's how it tends to manifest. But then what people are going to say is, but that's still the depression, but those are the symptoms that sort of come to the foreground. It's just that, and then if you look over here in the United States, people have those symptoms as well. We just don't see them as parts of the depression, but maybe they are. And this is what you get. You kind of get it when you do psychological testing. You use old tests like the MMPI, where those scales they include all these non-specific symptoms, and you begin to see that that these things are all kind of sometimes, again, they are parts of the depression. We don't always see them as parts of the depression, but you do want to understand that in order to sort of understand the case. Not to say that they could be secondary as well, but they're not. It's not necessarily seen as that way. Or the other example would be, oftentimes what you see is people may become depressed, and then what happens is, what you sometimes commonly see is, after they've been depressed for a while, then they develop an anxiety disorder, like panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And you can think of that as secondary to the depression, but it seems to be a natural part of the course of depression. So you could also think about it as, this is just a later stage of a more serious depression. So I understand what you're saying. I think that could be right, Rachel. And so the primary secondary distinction has always been hard to tease out. Is it something different? Is it a consequence, or is it a part of it? I'm just leaving it open the possibility that it's a part of it.
Thanks.
All right. We have maybe for today one last question from Awais Aftab. So the question is in the chat. I'm going to read it. In situations where surface phenomena or symptoms are not reflective of the existence of any underlying essence, should operational concepts be defined with explicit reference to the goals of the goals these operational concepts are intended to accomplish? For example, the DSM uses operational definitions, but there is no clarity on what these definitions are intended to accomplish.
Okay, sort of. Let me read your question just a second. Let me see. Yeah, I'm sorry, Anne Marie. Are effectively existence under this. Should operational concepts be defined to the goals he's originally intended? Oh, that's interesting. And what these definitions are intended to accomplish. There's no clarity in what these definitions are intended to accomplish. Well, Awais, aren't they intended to just be descriptions of the person's complaints? I mean, that's what descriptive psychopathology is, right? I think that, and then the idea was originally with Robbins and Gouset, I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, that if you correctly describe the syndrome, which would be the symptoms and the course, once you do that, that will be, and if you describe them properly, then that will allow you to classify like cases together, and then that will allow you to find underlying causal mechanisms. Once you get the description right, the mechanisms will follow. Oh, Awais, Awais knows this because we just did our chapter on this just recently. So that would be the idea, right? And then the problem is that they did describe them, but the mechanisms didn't follow. Is Awais not here? Oh, there he is.
Hi, Peter. Sorry. I guess my question is that, DSM-3 was implicitly embedded in this neo-Kraepelinian idea that, like if we describe them well enough, we'll discover these underlying disease entities.
Right.
And so if we, and now that dream is essentially shattered for the most part. So if we give up if we give up the idea that there are underlying entities, then the question is that, okay, we're describing, then what is the purpose of this description? Because we can describe in many different ways, as we know right now, there are many different ways you can categorize these symptoms. There are many different descriptions you can provide of the sort of like, psychopathological space. So the question then is, we have a plurality of possible operational definitions. And in such a scenario where you could, give multiple different descriptions, if we choose to describe in a certain way, should we have some clarity of like what that description is intended to do? Because there's no mere description by itself. We're always describing in service of something else.
Right. So that's good. I mean, obviously, RDoC could be seen as an attempt to re-describe the symptom space, right? I mean, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to re-describe the symptom space by focusing on dimensional constructs that have been implemented in neural circuits. The only thing I would say Awais too is that, like, yeah, that's true, but people, not everybody is going to say that sort of the DSM constructs are BS and that they're not scientifically useful. And they're going to say, there's a lot of, they've discovered a lot of things about schizophrenia and depression and panic disorder, a lot of important things about them, and they're continuing to discover a lot of important things about them, even if they're not necessarily discovering underlying mechanisms.
All right. Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna have to stop for today, but I would like to thank our speaker, Peter Zachar, for this interesting talk. Thank you so much for being here today. I thank you all to being here today. The Philosophy of Psychiatry webinar is almost, we are almost done with the schedule. There's only one session left in 2 weeks. So on June 24th, we're gonna have Natalia Washington, and the title will be announced soon. So thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Peter Zachar, and see you in 2 weeks.
All right.
Thank you. Bye. Et voilà.
Okay.
Ah, j'arrête le...